Welcome, everybody. My name is JB Skeepers, and today I'm in conversation with Retta van der Schuyf, a socio-economist that specializes in town transformations. Hi, Retta.
Hi, JB. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. You're a well-known town transformation specialist. And when I hear that, the first thing that comes to mind is, what is a town transformation specialist and what is a town transformation?
It's a great question, and let me begin by perhaps first explaining what a town transformation is, and then we can speak to what's the specialist involved in that process. So a town transformation program is a deliberate program, i.e. a program that you deliberately create in order to secure a new future for a town, a city, a region, or a place. And a town transformation specialist, therefore, is the person that coordinates, facilitates, directs, informs that strategy of how that future can be realized.
But what led you to actually become a town transformation specialist?
It's a little bit to the Steve Jobs anecdote where you can only in hindsight connect the dots. It wasn't that I one day woke up and said I want to become a town transformation specialist. So how it came about that in very early stages of my career I was involved in very complex programs of work, and increasingly complex, that ultimately culminated to lead the strategy for the continent of Africa. And through that, had to design strategies and product offerings and synchronized financial services offering into 15 different countries. And through that, became very deeply aware of this sense of different cultures and different places, and how from that begin to tell a story and to offer them something that is unique to them, but also complies with a higher structure. And I think through that, my interest developed. But it came from this background of complex transformations, increasingly aware of cultural issues. And then I think finally was this, as possibly one gets older, is how do you use your skills to do something that you add value to society? And I just, so appreciate this enormous potential that these potential projects offer to make a contribution on large scale. If you're lucky to get it right, but at least you get a shot to potentially create that potential.
We're part of leading this strategic engagement on a continent-wide level, and then you have focused to an extent into some cases within Namibia, and I understand there's a very interesting, unique case of Oranjemund. So maybe just to inform the listeners that might not be familiar with it, where is Oranjemund and what is sort of special about this town?
Oranjemund is this very unique desert town and or mining town that sits right in the southwestern corner of Namibia. And if people look at a map, you'll understand that that particular corner happens to sit where the Orange River meets the Atlantic Ocean. So it's on that corner a border town. What makes it unique is that it was, up until recently, so as recent as 2017, a privately owned and purpose-built town. Privately owned, meaning that a private sector, a company, actually created this town for the purposes of its industry. So it's a very artificial environment in some senses. But it also achieved this miraculous outcome where it's this very beautiful town that is green and it's almost like this oasis in the desert. So you shouldn't really expect this place to be there, and yet it exists. But the uniqueness lies in that where it's placed, but also this notion that was a purpose-built and a privately owned town until very recently. And one doesn't see a lot of that still in the world.
And you said it was privately owned. So who was this private owner?
The diamond mine, or at least in recent history, so perhaps we can go to previous owners of CDM and the companies that originally established Oranjemund, but in recent years, that private town was owned by a company with the name Namdeb. And Namdeb is a joint venture between De Beers, so the diamond mining company De Beers, and the government of Namibia.
Okay.
So owned by Namdeb. And if I say ownership, I should perhaps also qualify that and say that they owned all of the infrastructure, but of course the underlying land was leased from the government. So the mine never, and still to an extent, doesn't own all the underlying land. That is still owned by the public sector as part of the mining license. They have long-term leases over this land, but own the town in the sense of the infrastructure that was developed in the community that was developed, and the governance that was developed around that town was led by the mine and directed by the mine.
It was another mining asset.
Very nice way
part of the portfolio of all of the mining assets to
Correct.
Actually create the ability for them to mine.
It's a very important insight because that does speak to the interest of this particular environment where it was in essence a necessary enabler of a business. So that's not normally how you would create a sense of place or a sense of identity or a sense of belonging.
Yes.
But here it was the actual commercial reason.
Yes.
It required a community to be developed in order to host the workforce for the purpose of a commercial outcome and economic outcome.
All of that makes a lot of sense, especially on the fact that you say it's in the middle of the desert. It's actually a reasonably large community, and you used the word, obviously, to an extent artificial. You wouldn't expect it. All understandable. So that all makes sense to me. What did you have to be involved with from a transformation perspective? Why was there a need to transform?
The last part of your question is perhaps the easier part to answer, the simpler part, but I'll expand on the slightly more complex parts of your question thereafter. So the main reason why the town had to be transformed is you can imagine that diamonds were discovered in that territories in Namibia roughly about 1905, 1906. And from then on, a community was gradually developed. And of course, when you start at the outset of the discovery of a mineral resource, you kind of somehow have this unconscious assumption that would last forever.
Yes.
But fast forward 100 years later, we got to a point where a couple of intersects happened. The financial crisis happened that definitely had an impact on diamond pricing. And if your pricing is affected, of course, then you kind of had to look at, can I still effectively produce this product that I now need to sell? And that math no longer worked. So the life of mine that was assumed to still be multiple decades beyond that particular point all of a sudden changed. And there was a very, very real risk that the mine had to close. And because it was a purpose-built town, this is the important qualification, there was a critical dependency on a single industry.
Yes.
And if that industry collapses, that entire environment collapses.
Yes.
So the impetus to transform Oranjemund was this threat to the life of mine.
Yeah.
And now, all of a sudden, a very urgent and critical need to ensure a very different and diversified future. So this place still had a reason to exist, either instead of mining or alongside a declining industry, so that you don't end up with a destitute town that have no reason to be. So that was the immediate reason why.
Yes.
But what the complication in that I wanted to add, that was part of your earlier question, if you would allow me, is you kind of asked what was our involvement or where did we get involved? And in that particular case, because it was a privately owned town, a legal process happened before we were invited to participate, and they call that a process of proclamation. And that is a process whereby the government, at that particular point in consultation with the mine, agreed that it would actually make sense for the future of that town to become a public town. So it's transferring from being a privately owned and run and governed place. I mean, you have to understand there's no municipality up until that point. The mine operated as a municipality in that area. They built the houses, they built the infrastructure alongside their mining focus. So we were invited to get involved post that proclamation. So the decision was already made and the legal process was already concluded, which I think there's some kind of lessons to be learned that we perhaps in our discussion can elaborate on a little bit later. But then the final technical point that I want to just share, when one then kind of engages where there's now a need to kind of, well, yes, the legal process has happened. Now you need to get to a place where you need to kind of build very clear accountability frameworks where something was led by one stakeholder, need to switch to another. So we needed to help. How does the mine hand over its municipality responsibilities to the newly established local authority, which is a unique case? And at the same time, alongside that, need to figure out how do we economically diversify. So on the one, it was to help govern this transference of accountability and to reawaken the citizenry, who up until that point was really employees of a company, not really a truly normalized community. It was really there for the purposes of the mine. So our particular expressed responsibility was to help diversify the economy. That was the main reason. But then to help this post-proclamation state to actually shift accountability and or awaken new responsibilities across these three stakeholders, meaning the private sector, the public sector, and civil society.
I just want to quickly understand that. So this is a private town that later became a public town. And just for context, before this proclamation that you've mentioned, was each person inside of the town an employee or affiliated to the mine, or what happened with the public?
Public actually had to apply for permits to enter the town. So, for example, if you cross the border from South Africa into Namibia, you'd kind of perhaps want to have a rest stop or a coffee or into this town of Namibia, in Namibia, but you couldn't if you didn't have a pre-agreed permit that you had to apply to the Ministry of Mines and Energy.
Okay.
So in the absence of that particular permit, the only people that could enter it, if you're exactly right, are employees.
Okay.
And as a consequence, either people that are related to those employees or a few exceptions where they got permits to actually open small businesses. So whether there was a SPAR to provide retail offerings into the community, or perhaps somebody that opened a guest house on the fringes of that community were then also granted permission to actually settle there.
Okay.
But I think an extremely interesting part of your question that will not be obvious in that answer is, because of that point that only employees could live in the town, what happened at retirement is that those employees that might have spent the vast majority of their professional life in the mine, or in that town rather,
30, 40
years, then had to leave the town. Sometimes yet quite a lot of unsettlement because you're no longer employee and therefore you have no reason to be at that town, and therefore then had to resettle back in your home states or Cape Town or Windhoek or whatever the case might be. So again, just giving perhaps a little bit more color and texture to this artificial environment.
Exactly. So I'm pleased that you said you explained that. So it wasn't just on some paperwork. It was actually a fundamental way of it transcended into the rights of the residents in a major way.
Absolutely.
In how they conducted themselves and what rights they had to actually not remain.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So that is obviously a very, very extreme initial state, and now you have to try and make it a normal town like everything else, like you would normally see in Namibia. So quickly explain to me just some major milestones in terms of dates. When did this proclamation happen, or that process even start? And when did your salients become involved in this process?
In terms of what was the kind of timeline roughly in the story of Oranjemund, at least to my knowledge, and there's lots of history that predates where I'm going to start now, but I will start to the precursor of the town transformation process, is up until 2011, the mine consisted to run its operations in this private context, and all was well with the world. And then, as we said, along came the disruptor, which was the financial crisis, which led to pricing changes. It impacted Namibia a little bit later, so where the crisis happened around 2008, 2009, we're now kind of fast-forwarding to the point of 2011, where the decision was made to proclaim Oranjemund, and that was done between the mine and the government. And it was quite quickly executed, actually. And then through 2011 to 2014, I think in 2013, 14 was the actual first constitution of a new local authority there.
Okay.
Brand new staff. And the time that we got involved was in 2015, where the stakeholders understood there was actually inherently quite a lot of conflicts, although they shared the intent of what they ideally want as an outcome, how it should happen and what pace it should happen and under which conditions, then became quite convoluted. And at that point in 2015, we were brought in to help resolve that potential role clarity between especially the mine and the new local authority, and that transition of role accountabilities,
yes.
Point one. And point two, to through that process help create and align everybody on the same vision. Because when an opportunity like this represents, there's a lot of people that perhaps don't have quite the experience of town transformation work. So they come with very bold and almost naive ambitions of what can be. And of course, there will be natural biases that on the one hand, the mine wants to do the right thing, but it of course doesn't want to overinvest to something that is not its core business focus.
Yes,
it understands it's got a liability, it's got to understand it's got a responsibility. But on the other hand, the public sector is so cautious to take over something that was previously funded with very deep pockets. And what's the simple way that I kind of explain this to people is where the mines could afford to build pipes that last.
Yeah.
You've got a local authority that's operating on a bootstrap.
Yes.
And maybe it's lucky if it has a few thin pipes to put in place. And how do you make these two meet? And then the all-encompassing purpose was, in all of that, how do you, alongside that, come up with other economic and viable economic opportunities to diversify this landscape so that there's economic context and reason that can actually ground this place to have a sense of identity beyond mining, as mining either completely collapses or even just slowly declines, and to kind of just hedge against that risk.
Yes.
Because if you don't do that, then of course that town actually collapses. They call it a town collapse. And then what that means is a lot of people leave it, and the people that stay typically don't have jobs.
Yes.
So then you have a lot of social ills that establishes, and a lot of social unrest that can start, and a lot of lawlessness that we've seen in bigger places elsewhere in the world. They call it a derelict town or a feral town.
So some parts of, let's say, Chicago and Namibia, there's the case of Kolmanskop.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Ghost towns in essence.
Yes.
Yeah, more recent like Detroit in the States.
Sorry, Detroit, yes.
Yes, so there are plenty of examples where that has happened.
Yes.
And of course, and especially on a border town, it's the last thing that you would want. And also you have so much invested infrastructure there.
Yes.
You know, how do you balance how to solve for that?
So, okay, so you've obviously spoken about the former heavyweight in the context is the mine, and everything was about the mine. Now, in comes this new player, being the local authority / public sector, big boots that it needs to fill. But somewhere in between that is obviously a whole host of other stakeholders and other players. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, I certainly will. And you're right. That's kind of just the key, heavyweights in the picture. The other key heavyweight in that picture, of course, is the civil society or community. Let's call it that, which ultimately needs to kind of somewhere begin to transition, where some of them remains employees, but some of them become only citizens or residents at least. So those are the three main stakeholders. But then very quickly you have to understand, if we for a moment focus on the public sector, yes, you've got the local authority, but the local authority is tied to a regional governance structure that is tied to a national governance structure. So you've got all of those stakeholders, because if you're going to do asset investment or land use distribution that is different to what it was for, the local authority doesn't have all the kind of levels of decision-making at their level of governance. Okay. So you have to begin to involve all layers of government, and that's how the structures, at least in the case of Namibia, works. Actually, on a regional level, there's also regional councillors that looks after sub-regions within a large region. So there's complexities of decision-makers in that realm.
Okay.
If I look at it, just to answer your question perhaps more thoroughly, also you will look at your private sector of, yes, who are the current incumbents, like we've discussed, or in the case of Arrangement, the mine. You also need to look at, well, what other champions of industry are there in the broader region or in the country or even internationally that can begin to help you persuade some of the stakeholders to be involved in the process of transformation, either in bringing their industry there or to be off-takers of products that is produced there. So you need to begin to think about stakeholders in a very broad context of, who are business owners, but who could be future investors into that town. And then, of course, like we said, we also need to look at all sorts of bunches of public benefit organizations, charities, social development agencies, and then ultimately also the citizens. Because something that people quite often overlook in these types of towns is that people expect the big investors to come. So they're going to say, well, mining is collapsing. Let's build, a big tourism offering, and we look for tourism operators to come and invest. Well, that's not easily going to happen if they don't have citizens and or communities that can use these assets and begin to form a sense of stickiness. So your actual investors, surprisingly, is your actual citizens. How do you create a sense of place? How? Because, again, something that I overlooked to share earlier is another anomaly of Oranjemund and a private town is the employees and citizens didn't own their homes. None of them owned their homes. It was given to them as part of their package. So they have
the employment package.
Okay. And then to transition them, to give them the choice to actually own homes. I mean, to the concept of home ownership being new.
Yes.
And for them to choose to invest there and therefore choose to uphold their asset, and therefore events around their assets is actually the bottom up that you need to do alongside the top down. So the stakeholder group is really diverse. And on top of that, you need to bring in experts that might know, if you think agriculture is a potential, how do you bring them on board? If you think tourism potential has some viability. So there's this whole raft of stakeholders that has interest or potential interest that you have to bring in and balance quite early on.
Everything that you've explained now, it is abundantly clear that we're just scratching the surface, but the complexity, it is unbelievably complex.
Absolutely.
And you're talking, obviously, I have the sense of there's this incumbent dependency that you've alluded to through the residents not even owning the places that they stay in. So there's this reality, and that obviously perforates broadly into everything about being a resident in that town, through to all of these future projected hopes of potential future industries. And starting a business in its own right is a single business is a very complicated endeavor at the best of times. So you've got you're dealing with a status quo that is relatively encumbered in its dependency, and you have quite high aspirations. And I want to understand, why would the mine bother with this complexity? So yes, I understand that there's liability, but why would they bother with it? And if they are bothering with it, there's two ways of doing it. It's either you kind of just act as if you are doing it, or you actually commit and you do this to a deep level.
Yes. It's a very challenging question, and I hope you can do it justice. We'll begin to kind of talk a little bit around to why would a mine? Why did Namdeb, and therefore why would mines? Because I think Namdeb is obviously a very good representation of what a lot of manufacturing industries possibly, or extractive industries, would face, where they, and I wouldn't say it's just these industries, but industries like that unintentionally created these dependencies. In some places, which is not the case for Namdeb, there is a legal liability. So, for example, in the places of Canada, a mine up front increasingly need to put and reserve some funds to actually hold them to account to restitute or transform that environment post-mining. So there's a true legal liability there, or legal obligation. In the case of the mine, that was not quite the case. But what was true is, in order to achieve a closure certificate when a mine eventually closes, there are increasing conditions that they need to comply with, and one of it, of course, is restitution of the environment. So maybe they disturb the land in the process of mining, and that's already a well-established regulatory or compliance etiquette, is to restore that environment as best you can, or to very high standards, and ideally to the state that it was before. And a lot of the mines are actually already doing that now as they mine, and not leaving it to the last piece. But what increasingly came to the consciousness of societies and of the world of mining and just the global world is this expectation that there's also a social liability that you've created. So you did kind of create this social dependency unintentionally, and of course with very good reason. But when it comes to the closure of the mine, now that liability exists, and you cannot just walk away from it. So in the case of Namdeb, that's a little bit complex. It was that social liability that wasn't just truly created, it was also by their brand stated quite clearly that they stick to the communities that serve them, or that they've created a relationship with, and are very committed to that notion to do right by that community. So I really applaud Namdeb, and therefore De Beers and the government of Namibia as shareholders into this organization that took that implied obligation and turned it into a responsibility.
Okay.
So that's the one way that I want to answer you, and I want to be very clear that I really believe that was a very brave thing of the mine to do that, and to do that quite early in comparison with other companies globally, who might have walked away, or perhaps just did lip service and just kind of put a few plasters on this piece to kind of dress it up.
Okay. So they leaned into the complexity.
They leaned into the complexity. They bought into the notion. The part that I kind of think one has to just have a lot of empathy to understand the complexity, even on a social psychology perspective, is although the mine truly factually and technically bought into this obligation, to this intent, and clearly put a lot of financial resources and effort and time towards this, the deepest identity, which they, of course, have some kind of a blind spot to, as we all do, has such a deep sense of ownership over that place that almost emotively and or from a very deep sense of ownership energetically was emotionally very hard for them to actually truly let go. And I don't judge that, because that is just something one could imagine would be the case if such a sense of ownership has developed over 100 years. It's very hard all of a sudden now to let go of an entire environment that you've created and governed. So I think that piece, the mine was intentional, but I think the real delivery on that, that identity had not yet sufficiently evolved by the time that I exited to truly let go, to make space for others to with ease enter into that space as co-leaders.
And was that that reluctance to let go, was that driven from, in your view, a protecting of the asset that they had paid for, managed, run, and been accountable for, or a mistrust into the new incumbent filling those shoes? What? Because I wouldn't be able to know which one is a bigger issue.
A really incisive question. I think the answer is both.
Okay.
It truly is both. Because on the one hand, you do have a sense of propriety or ownership over something that you are so heavily invested. So there is this sense of ownership. But also you've got a very new appointed public sector that doesn't have the same level of experience yet and can't be expected to have. And here you have a deep skill set of how to govern this town in the way that you could do it with the funds available to you, with the philosophy, with the kind of commercial backing of it. And now you need to let go to a very immature public sector. Not that they didn't have the potential. There was just really, through lack of previous history, a huge mistrust that the new leaders can do it, because here we've got evidence that we've done it so well on our terms and our way for so long. So it's both those, and it's very insightful that you could see that those are the two conflicts.
Yes.
And again, it's unconscious. I'm not talking about intentionality here.
Yeah.
I'm talking about underlying deep-seated identities, which is then ultimately also, of course, part of certain transformations.
And it speaks, I mean, there's a broader, probably all over the world, there's a broader trend of a slight mistrust in different ways between public and private sector, and it speaks about the mechanisms of how you hold people accountable. It's the mechanisms of what do you measure merit on, performance on, etc., etc. And that would also be just transitioning that understanding would be
very
a super
nicely
complicated point.
Exactly. And the way that I would kind of want to add to that point that you're very subtly making is, especially in the case of Namibia, I don't think it's unique to Namibia, but it's definitely, in my opinion, at least true to Namibia, is, as recent as 1990, it went through a liberation struggle. And quite often through a liberation process, you have a somewhat socially minded political structure. And then with that liberation comes the intent to almost, ironically, in another way, paternalistically prescribe how the economy should develop. So there was a lot of infrastructure development that was unlocked through the government that was really necessary and very valuable, but they need a habit that the public sector stimulates the economy. So when now we apply that potential view to the case of Oranjemund, here you had a private sector that had to now make space for a public sector that did not have a lot of experience, but a public sector that came with the expectation that they will lead the economic growth, which in a normalized environment is also not truly the right balance. It's actually the public sector should play an economic development enabling environment that would lead to the private sector, not just the mine, but all sorts of other new incumbents to actually fulfill their development role on an economic and or industry level. So the battle wasn't just about the ownership of the town, but was also the ownership of who leads economic development and on what terms. And I think, and now I'm speaking on behalf of the mine, and again, this is my professional opinion, is there was also underlying fear that, if I can just bluntly put it, that the mine needs to fund the economic strategy of the public sector, which the mine might not necessarily agree with. So our funding is a veil to somebody else that's going to make decisions that we might not think is in the best interest of the future of the town. So the mistrust was on multiple levels, but also historic conditioning of whose roles is what.
Yes.
Which comes for me to the notion that naively roles were not clearly identified to the right level.
Yes.
And of course it was in a moment in time. There's no judgment, it's just a learning.
Yes.
In a point in time.
So you had an incumbent, commercially driven reality and enterprise that has been the status quo for generations.
Generations.
And in comes the new public sector, who in itself is also struggling with a broader transformational topic, which is we have thus far been leading Namibia's economic trajectory agenda, and that is possibly no longer the case. So it's the public sector stepping into the roles of private sector, but the public sector actually needs to now also be playing a role of opening the door for private sector.
Correct. And that was inherently conflict driven. And yes.
So that very much reminds me of these little dolls. Yeah, it's a lot of nesting.
Very well put.
It's a lot of nesting that's going on. It's abundantly clear that the complexity is far beyond drawing some lines on a map. Maybe you could speak to why town that's dealing with a potential transformation should not be just knocking on the next urban designer's door and actually going to a town transformation specialist. I mean, it sounds abundantly clear to me at this stage, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more.
Yes. The way that I'm going to want to answer your question is perhaps just first kind of give this, draw out this picture of the three buckets that's involved. And it's oversimplification, but let's say broadly 3 buckets of activities that's involved in the process of transforming a town from a current state to a future state. And one of it is this bucket of stuff that, in Salience language, we, Salience being our company, refers to technical infrastructure. And here we are really kind of putting everything or grouping everything that's to do with land use, land allocation, town boundaries, city boundaries, boroughs, spatial planning, urban planning, as you've just mentioned, infrastructure development, which includes access, so it's bulk infrastructure, it's critical infrastructure, it's housing,
sewage, water, electricity.
Everything that, it's a big lump sum. It's, of course, oversimplification. Then the second bucket is what I can call social infrastructure. Social infrastructure on the top level, easy level, refers to this notions of healthcare, hospitals, clinics, primary healthcare, tertiary healthcare, educational level. So are there schools there? Are there high schools there? Are there universities there? Are there other forms of educational institutions? Are there forms of NGOs or other bodies that is involved in the process of human development? Security, social security, policing, all of that. Less obvious stuff is, of course, then looking at the social structure of the identity, the sense of belonging, the norms, the behavioral patterns in that town. And then there's the economic infrastructure that says, well, what are the industries? What are the skill set? What are the employment levels? What are the value chains in that environment? An urban and a town planner does mainly that first bucket. But I want to be clear that industry is also fast expanding. So I absolutely want to acknowledge that they play and or fulfill that role with a strong lens of understanding what might need to happen in the social and economic buckets, especially the urban planners that need to understand the flow of humans and the flow of economics as they technically design a city. But they're not responsible for the delivery on the social and economic front, where the town transformation specialists are really responsible for governing the framework of all 3 of those buckets, not through its design, but through its implementation. So it's the vision and or the implementation strategy across all 3, where the urban and town planners deliver on 1 with knowledge and or engagement and appreciation of 2 and 3.
Now, speaking about this third bucket, so I understand the second bucket, social infrastructure, but I'd like to hone in a little bit on the third bucket. Can you elaborate a little bit, like what does that strategy, how do you even start that forward-looking strategy for the economics of a town that has never had any other economics other than mining?
You're right. That was kind of the key focus area for us in the case of Oranjemund. It didn't exclude these other components, as I previously intimated, but our fundamental role was to ensure that we can get to a diversified economy by a particular time frame.
Yes.
So in your earlier question, we started 2015, and then because, and this is perhaps also an important piece for people to understand, it takes about 15 years for a transformation to really mature. So we therefore created a vision initially for what would be a diversified economy. So what are the qualifying criteria, what are the goals of what the town should and must look like at minimum by 2030, so 15 years later.
Okay.
So that was our moonshot. And the end state is by that point, there must be a diversified town that can actually sustain itself alongside or irrespective of the mining industry being there or not. So as a consequence, we needed to kind of say, well, what in this period of time can we do to create different and alternative sources? So now answering your question, we went in as what you normally would do is with the community and with that broad stakeholder group, do a very quick but deep assessment of what is the true current state. Where is it geographically placed? What does that geography lend itself to, pros and cons? Economically, where is it positioned? How close is it to markets? What environmental capabilities are there? For example, what does the soil quality look like? Can you start agriculture there? Is it a place on a map where people perhaps could, is there actual natural interest that could stimulate a tourism industry? So you have to do what we call economic scanning, where you kind of look at, right, what might be potential as a consequence of place, where it is located, and as a consequence, what is allowed around it geographically and economically. But at the same time, you also need to kind of look at the maturity of either the current incumbents. So now, like we know, we've got a society that has not really been stimulated on entrepreneurial levels, in quite the fact it's been discouraged up until that point. To what extent are they able to actually take on a new identity and respond to it? Are newcomers going to be attracted to this very bizarre little town? Yeah, many attractive elements to it, but still quite bizarre. Why would you come and bring capital to that environment? So that scanning is really important. From that, you identify a lot of potential. Maybe this is possible. Maybe this is possible. So you're going to go alongside that process. What do the community desire? Because maybe they actually have desires that you could leverage and unlock. So you, with the stakeholders, and especially the citizens, begin to look at what is, what was, what could be, and what do we desire? Once you've completed that process, then you very quickly have to go in what we call it, and you as an energy developer will understand you have to go into a feasibility. So what of these do we have to put through lenses of, is it really possible? Is it really possible? And then the final lens that we applied in the case of Oranjemund, once we've got this long list of economic development opportunities at different levels of sizes, we looked at, is it really viable? So even if it's technically feasible, will it actually create enough jobs? Will it create enough stickiness? Will it actually make enough money to replace some elements of GDP? And that was the lenses that we kind of quickly went into once we kind of created this understanding of what the vision might look like and how we will measure it.
Yes.
I just also kind of quickly want to kind of just haste to add in the kind of case of Oranjemund, also in that case, what we really kind of needed to look at was also says the mine did build infrastructure, and a lot of the infrastructure will go in disuse if the mine doesn't continue to operate. So one of that processes was also to look at what assets exist in that environment that we could upcycle to actually have a very different purpose to what it had before.
Okay, so it's almost leveraging the incumbent infrastructure.
Of course,
yes,
you've got to look to first, because it's very difficult to attract new capital. So you have to first start with what is there so that we can provide some kind of stickiness that might actually attract outside investors. So, you have to follow the money in a way first.
Yes.
And if you just allow me for one particular example that for me, unfortunately, we didn't quite execute on this one, but it's just a fantastic example of what I mean, is an accident of the environment is how the mine worked. And one has to have huge respect for how Namdeb literally pushed the ocean wall hundreds of meters into the ocean to actually discover or mine more diamonds that was in that shallow water, if you like. Through that process, they had actually kind of pushed that seawall there and then actually delved behind that seawall to what they call the rock bed. So that's below sea level. And then constantly pumped seawater out that filtered through that wall slowly so they can actually work on that rock bed to discover and harvest the diamonds that would have filtered over centuries or decades to that rock bed through the sand.
Yes.
But once they finished mining in that territory, the ocean reclaims. And you almost had this natural sea lakes that one could do a lot of aquaculture and sea development strategies, whether it's oyster farming, whether it's algae farming. And again, to kind of just say asset that you didn't have to invest a lot in could then become the foundations of a new industry. So you have to look for these catalysts.
These type of things.
Correct.
So, and for any of the listeners that are interested in it, I can very much advise, go and look at Google Earth. Type in Oranjemund and go and check that coastline. It is unbelievable, that process that you've just described. I'm very aware of it and really very, very impressive. But back to this topic. I'd like to also, so you've given an example of an idea there. Maybe you could detail a few successes that were achieved in this new direction of economic endeavor, as well as some, let's say, missed opportunities in your view, and ones that were, let's say, identified but adequately pushed aside because they made no sense. But those sort of three categories would be interesting for me to hear.
Yes, a lot of this is in the beginning to set expectations right. So if you're going to look just in the infographic, you can see this image where you have this container that have this massive big stone in it. So this leading industry, this critical industry, this white knight. And you're going to just see this small little grains of sand around it, which might have been the retail shop where people could buy their groceries, or the little petrol station where people could put in petrol. But the kind of dominant economy is this one big piece of rock. Mm-hmm. And because it was diamond mining, it was a very high earning industry. It's very seldom, it's only the few towns that get it lucky that can actually replace like for like. So if this big industry collapses, it's very seldom that you have another big industry that can replace it. So as you can see from the infographic, you need to set your ambitions realistically that you can perhaps not replace that entire GDP that's created by this wealthy industry, but you can and should create at least 2 or 3 others that will give enough density and texture around which other smaller businesses and even smaller businesses and grassroots businesses can develop. So before I kind of break those buckets down, I just want to say in the beginning of these transformations, you have to be very mindful, especially where it's an economic decline impetus, that your new goal has to be very modest to begin with. Yeah. It doesn't preclude the opportunity for further economic development to again grow to something quite substantial or surpass it, but you have to start quite humble.
So, and if I may, just so that I fully understand, that also speaks a little bit to not blindly pursuing things to try and match. You from the outset are cognizant and realistic enough to say that there is going to be contraction regardless, but we're just trying to avoid collapse.
Love that. Exactly that. It's exactly that. And you need to kind of figure out what that is. And part of that, of course, is informed. But part of it is also a bit of a guess. But again, you actually kind of want to make sure that at minimum you avoid that threshold, because then it becomes all the harder to go and pick it up at a much lower state.
Exactly.
And rebuild. And so much more effort needs to go in to actually get it to a decent level on which to build.
But it also speaks to, which I can only imagine, and you'll maybe fill in on some of these topics when you answer the examples, but it probably also speaks to guarding yourself against distractions.
Very much like that. And I think to our earlier conversation, that point of distraction was a little bit of a contention between the citizens and the public sector, because the public sector had very ambitious goals.
Yes.
And the mine possibly had to, it's almost that Goldilocks effect. Yeah, the one wants a little bit too much and the other wants too little. And how do you get it just right in between?
I remember.
I call that the Goldilocks effect.
Yes.
And yeah, so the incentive was the public sector wanted as much as possible and very audacious expectations before minimum thresholds were reached.
Yes.
And of course, the mine was very afraid of that kind of very ambitious goals without putting the right foundations in place first.
Yes. Yeah.
And therefore, we kind of had that tension.
I do remember at the time a lot of media was circulating in Namibia where people were proclaiming that Oranjemund would become the new Dubai in Africa or Namibia, and there was going to be marinas for yachts, and there was going to be all sorts of things, which I remember at the time thinking, this sounds very distracting.
Correct. And I love what you say, because you're not nullifying that potentials.
Yes.
So you're not taking it off the board, but you actually are prioritizing it implied in your statement, which is exactly the case. I call it the first things first principle. So you have to kind of make sure that you secure at least minimum fundamentals.
Yes.
Not losing sight of that higher ambitions, that is the art of possibility.
Yeah.
But you can't jump to that as your first ambition, because then you're going to get so many of the basics wrong. to first kind of just get your baseline secured first on which to then rebuild. So that's a very incisive point.
Okay. So now back to the question that we've sort of been percolating around, but I'd love to hear some concrete examples of these various near misses, distractions that were maybe missed, or things, maybe there were distractions that were pursued. Maybe you could detail a few of these.
There's a lot, and I think I will start with the ones that perhaps were sort of to the realm of misdirection rather than distraction. But there was a misdirection right from the outset that one of the populist desires from the community was to build a casino and to actually kind of make, and again, if you're in an environment where there's, yes, some wealth that was created through the diamond industry, but not a lot of that was contained there. That was a civ economy, meaning that the economies that were made there were typically taken elsewhere. So the miners came there, made their money, the product was exported to the UK, and the workers took their money back either to the north of Namibia or to Cape Town. It wasn't really spent there. So that's what we call a civ economy. So we needed to kind of make that more of a circular economy. But in my opinion, without wanting to disrespect anybody that raised that would not be a project to pursue in the long-term interest that would create sustainability. It's more, economic erosion that would take place.
Yes.
Another example that I would put into that bucket would have been where right at the outset there was a kind of focus of transforming Oranje through the notion of establishing a mall.
Yes.
And again, this notion was,
which is not too dissimilar from a casino.
Which is not dissimilar from a casino. And again, no disrespect to what retail opportunity present to citizens. And of course, one can, you have some recreation and some, kind of lifestyle fulfillments that happen in that environment. But it was an element that was identified or focused on too soon in the life cycle before we even knew what citizenry would remain or what new citizenry would be attracted as the town transforms.
And malls have a terrible reputation for extracting off the high street any money, any investment from the civic society, or not even social, just society.
Yes.
And then suddenly it's all being concentrated in this little enclave, and the rest of a town potentially becomes a little more derelict.
Correct. And again, to my point is also in the mining industry, you have to understand because the community represents the employees, like a normalized structure in an employee environment is you've got a few top earners that can really have the spare capital to distribute to all sorts of, let's say distractions, but, valuable distractions in some cases. But a vast majority of that town to an extent are your laborers. And therefore they do not have deep pockets. So again, to kind of perhaps misdirect some of that too early before some level of economic well-being has been widespread established, I think was, misdirection.
Agreed.
So that's kind of perhaps an example in that space, an example of things that we perhaps did get right in the right time. And again, here I would definitely want to credit the mine that started with that a little bit earlier to our involvement, where they started a desert agriculture research facility on site in Oranje. It started a little bit as a social project, but then actually kind of led to a lot of the food production that was previously imported from Cape Town or imported from Windhoek via Cape Town or other places was beginning to be locally replaced. And a lot of effort and investment from the mine went into that. So I definitely want to applaud and acknowledge them for that. But I think that was a really reasonable, small, realistic start for that environment. Okay. And then also focuses on beginning to provide more tourism offerings, so small Airbnbs or just bed and breakfasts that could open up that was not previously allowed. So very small wins that we made quite early on. Because we kind of left the project, of course, once that economic blueprint was there was some, I think, bigger economic development opportunities that was left on the table still by the time our relationship terminated in terms of getting to them to a place of maturity. And that would be, for example, the aquaculture you're speaking to. We also strongly believe there was huge renewable energy opportunities in that area, which now, of course, 10 years later has transpired to be very true.
Yes.
And I think 2 or 3 other opportunities that I hope and believe Oranje is still pursuing is that it could rebrand itself into becoming a retirement village. It's got a lot of, I think, attributes that is conducive to that environment. It's got access by road, access by air. It is flat. It is a safe environment. It's a calm environment. It's quite a stable climate. And another area that we thought could also be something that could form part of its future identity was a physical rehabilitation center, what they call a step-down facility. So maybe somebody had a heart attack or somebody had an rehabilitation, that they could go to that safe place and recover with ease in quite a calm environment,
Okay.
where a lot of infrastructure exists that could be upcycled to actually become either retirement accommodation with potential free care facilities because of the good hospital, the mine bolt. But there's also a golf course that's falling in disrepair and disuse that could be used where people could safely recover with spaces that lends itself to health recovery.
Okay.
But those are not yet fully matured.
Okay, so I would like to also understand, you're appointed as a town transformation specialist. What's the first thing that you're going to focus on in this complete web? I wouldn't know where to start.
In the particular situation of Oranjemund, I was invited by a gentleman called Mike Friedman, who runs an agency called Free Thinkers. And definitely from my perspective, would look towards Mike as the grandfather of placemaking. And he was invited at that particular point to come and co-create with the mine, with the public sector and with civil society what the vision for the future town would look like. So the place where we started was to actually run an exercise across the community in very practical and very hands-on ways from all stratas of that community. So it was from the cleaners to the guy that puts in your petrol to the school children that Mike invited to do art projects and poetry to kind of describe what do they see as a future. And that's where we kind of got to the notion to kind of start gathering what is desired from that place. So we started with that process of understanding what is the local environment and what does it actually wish for.
Yes.
Not yet to say that it would happen, but just to extract, because you would never and should never overlook that the local community actually knows a lot about that place.
Yeah.
And if you don't listen to that, you might overlook a lot of potential.
Yes.
Of course, you need to bring ideas from the outside in, but the inside in
there's
knows
also
a
a lot
lot.
of wisdom.
A lot of wisdom. And to sift through that to find, excuse the kind of metaphor now, find diamonds in the rough was definitely one thing. And Mike is extraordinarily gifted in that process.
Okay.
So one was to come up with that vision 2030, as we termed it at that particular point in time. And then ultimately from that, our next step was from that to distill what we call almost design principles.
Okay.
So we came up with these 4 principles that would represent on which criteria, do we create a sense of belonging, a sense of place, a sense of economic belonging. The other principle was, do we conserve the heritage, but also the natural assets of the environment? And are we diversifying? So that was kind of the principles that we went into that become then the fundamental ways to begin to break down and start the process of actually developing skills in the community. Very importantly, shifting their mindsets, right? Because it's not just the technical transformations that need to take place.
Yeah.
It is this notion of your identity is tied to being a mining town. Without yet knowing what that new identity is, how do we begin to shift your identity to be open?
Yes.
Because that was the other kind of notion, is this kind of notion of opening, welcoming.
Yeah.
To kind of make sure that they can actually begin to embrace, to play an active part in a new future. Because in the absence of doing that, they're unintentionally resistant.
Yes. Yeah, and that's stakeholder 101.
Yes, and if you don't mind, and again, forgive me, but I do think it's maybe just quite an important component is in the story of Oranjemund. Once we did all these assessments, then of course the time was to put forward solutions and to start driving implementation. Right?
Yes.
These things are not necessary chronologically. You need to do all of these in parallel.
And I also want to understand who owns all of this. Who's ultimately the person that does all of this?
That's
is it
the
public
town
sector or is it the mines?
So the town transformation specialist coordinates this, facilitates this.
Yes.
In the case of Oranjemund, we had a situation where we appointed, the mine appointed us, but they appointed us to be acting on behalf of the public sector and the civil society and the mine. So we were paid for by the mine, but our role was to be that objective facilitator that needed to coordinate the right points of compromise and decision-making between the private sector, the public sector and the civil society.
And the objective.
You do your best, of course.
Yeah.
And again, I would like to say that Salient had a very strong brand in the town to actually be that, so that we were trusted by the mine authentically and for good reason, and we were trusted by the public sector for good reason, and were seen to acting in the good interest of all. Of course, we couldn't bridge all the challenges, but certainly achieved a fair amount in earning trust.
So I understand a lot better how you then became involved, how you owned and facilitated the creation of this town transformation strategy. But the strategy is not worth the paper it's written on unless if you actually operationalize it. How does that work, or how did it work in Oranjemund?
I think that's the part that I'm probably most, in hindsight, proudest of, because I fully agree with you. I'm definitely, as a specialist in this space, very much focused and passionate about creating the what and the why, but the how to. How do you actually go about making it happen is where Salience distinguishes.
Yeah.
That's really my passion and our company's strength. And there are a number of ways in which we started that process of implementation. But the key things that I think was fundamental in part of this implementation strategy was, again, if I go back to that earlier notion, is in many of the case research that we did, because of course, one of the components that I should said that we quite early do is not just understand that sense of place, is also do a lot of international research to make sure that we, without thinking that we can superimpose their issues and solutions onto us, how can we still distill lessons, generic lessons that one should watch for? And one of the lessons that we distilled, especially from mining towns that was created elsewhere, one being Elliot Lake in Canada, from a place called Elliot Lake in Ontario, but also closer to home Kleinseer, which was just at that point 300 kilometers south of Oranjemund.
In South Africa.
In South Africa, is that the mines continue to want to govern that process of transformation because they have such a sense of ownership. But with the deepest respect, miners are excellent engineers, and the ingenuity, especially that Namdeb applied, is extraordinary, but they're not economic developers. And therefore, to actually hedge against that fact, we proposed 2 vehicles to be created, not just for that reason alone, but that was definitely strong contributing reasons, where we created a company called UMDIS, and UMDIS is an economic development vehicle, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but also a vehicle called OMD 2030. And the OMD 2030 was created for 2 reasons. One, to kind of be that umbrella entity as a special purpose vehicle. So it's created in legal terms as a public benefit organization that have members. And the members was then, of course, members of the mine and members of the public sector, but also members from civil society, which then can bring a new independent decision-making body, not about the town, that's the public sector's responsibility, but about the process of transformation, decision-making about that. So that's where you united the stakeholders through a fair platform of shared decision-making.
Okay, so they all own the strategy as being part of the OMD 2030 platform.
Correct, so that was the vehicle that we created for that purpose.
Okay.
And to create this uniting identity, to kind of have this creative third, if you can almost call that, to kind of, create this body outside of their normal responsibilities, which stays in place. So this is not to be in conflict to that ownership. And so OMD 2030 was all about the uniting strategy that is then collectively co-created on. But the other face of OMD 2030 was also, as you possibly have understood from my question so far, town transformation has really got these 2 core components. One is this very technical parts about new land, building houses, building new industries, making sure there's healthcare access to all. So it's the very technical components, but it's got this whole notion of the entire identity of that place needs to evolve or radically transform even. And there are norms in that place. There are senses of identity and behavior and mindsets.
On a personal level.
On a personal level, on a institutional level, and on a town identity level. The whole town's identity, and therefore everybody within that, is I'm a diamond mining town.
So the subculture of that community
is tied. So now through that vehicle of OMD 2030, we did a little social engineering or re-engineering to actually work with the community on a social psychology basis to transform their mindset, to be open to different choices and to be open to transforming that identity as it's being changed to maybe become a retirement village and or tourism village, but that the identity is no longer, we know Oranjemund is a mining town.
Yes.
Because the mine is going to collapse at some point, and if it is not now, it will at some point of the future because the resource is ultimately finite.
Yes.
The other vehicle, OMDs, that we kind of created was for the purposes of true economic development. And the intent of that vehicle was to actually appoint independent specialists, ideally nationally, so champions of industry that has an entrepreneurial mindset and an investment skill set, to come and sit in that environment, and then with the assets that's been granted into this process, with the funding that's been granted into the process, actually drive the development projects, so doing true economic development work, but ideally at arm's length of both the mine and the public sector.
So it's almost a bespoke incubator.
Correct.
In a way.
Correct.
But this is UMDIS.
That is UMDIS, but not divorced, of course, from input from these very critical stakeholders.
Yes.
But to a point that their prior biases or previous conditioning of their roles don't interfere with what is true economic development strategies on good principles of economic sustainability, which the mine is not predisposed to, nor the public sector. So that was the purpose for which we created UMDIS. It's in the process of being matured towards that aim. At the moment, it's being created, or we set it up. Salience created UMDIS and the idea behind it, based on all this case history that we drew from other places, and the world trend of actually doing these transformations now through vehicles that could be protected against this interference, unintentional interference, and social biases, as we've almost kind of described. And it's really well funded by the mine, which again I applaud them deeply for, but it's now in the process where it actually needs to be resourced by economic development specialists, true economic development specialists, to complement the current resourcing from mine employees.
Okay. And then sort of to close up my penultimate question, what would you rate the success so far for these two vehicles? So it's the social mindset shifting vehicle, OMD 2030, as well as the other vehicle being the sort of economic incubator type vehicle, UMDIS.
Yes.
What would you say now that has moved into into an operational phase? What has been their success?
If you would allow me, I would actually just answer the very fact that they exist are the successes. I mean, previous in the history of Namibia, I wouldn't say that there were no precedent to these types of organizations before. In fact, you do have precedent around this, but it's the first ones that is actually well understood and well approached and well designed for the particular unique purposes. I think that in the kind of case of the OMD 2030, the key successes that is achieved is that it's truly kind of created for the first time several engagements where the community can actually begin to reunite around social issues. So it has lots of events that it organizes, from simple things like a monthly fair to a fun run, to where there's a sense of play and a sense of connectivity that is kind of introduced there. And the other huge success is that we trained now 6 almost kind of social coaches into that environment that are now technically skilled and has the skill set on a very social level to, on the ground, begin to work with the community to actually begin to transfer some of their mindsets towards this concept of being more open and receptive to change, and to understand that their sense of agency needs to develop to play an active role as a citizen from a town rather than an employee of a company.
Okay.
That's on the hand of OMD 2030. There's lots of small things that is being done. So there's lots of successes one can complement into that vehicle, and the incredible work that they've done, even resilience programs into schools. So there's the amazing work that they've done there, and really immensely proud of that impact. Subtle, intangible, but still very meaningful for the future. And I think in UMDIS is also led by very capable people from the mine that is doing very strong development work in creating potential around these economic development opportunities that we've discussed before, especially around desert agriculture, and also doing a lot around the tourism development in that particular industry. So I think a lot of successes, early successes. So again, perhaps not yet, perhaps, huge white knights, but I think it's kind of creating that potential.
Okay.
With the arrival of potential renewable energy on their doorstep, I foresee that they perhaps have new opportunities that again might come within reach of them to actually actively invest in, to actually truly diversify the economy.
Okay. And this is, I would imagine you're referring to the whole green hydrogen topic in the south of Namibia.
That's absolutely correct.
Okay. If you could have started all over again, what would you have done differently or emphasized absolutely must be done differently as a result? Because obviously not everything was in your hands.
Correct. And if you will, I will definitely be self-critical in a moment, but perhaps if I can just for a moment answer that question of what I think the entire process could have done differently, and then perhaps what we could have done differently in that. I think the one fundamental principle, to the extent that there are still private towns, is the big missed opportunity, and again, it wasn't with any bad intent, it was just inexperience, was that the town was proclaimed without there being a pre and a post proclamation plan. So there was really good intent and aligned intent that everybody wanted this town to survive and wanted to invest in that being the case. But there was absolute lack of clarity of whose responsibility it is, to what level, on what aspects of that development, who will lead what are the expectations of one another, what does a diversified town look like, to what extent is the mine liable for that, how will we go about that? So I think a lot of the pain that was involved in the Oranjemund case in trying to figure that out in the absence of such direction could have been saved if some of that brokering and negotiation or expectation setting even could have been done up front. So it was, in a way, with good intent, blindly proclaimed.
Yeah. So
they proclaimed.
So they bought the house before they saw the house, kind of thing.
Correct, and wasn't even sure if we're buying a duplex or we're wanting actually a flat, and who's going to pay for the flat, and when will we move in, and how will we decorate it.
Yes.
So if we want to use that analogy you drew, so I think that's one fundamental thing that I would do differently in the case of Oranjemund. Two is what I would also definitely kind of said is that something that I kind of think is still perhaps a missed opportunity that I think was well understood but not well implemented yet, is this notion that when there was true urgency that the mine would close, there was a lot of focused attention. But everybody understood that you would regardless have to transform this town at some point. But what happened in order of events was the mine found a way to renew its life and extend its life, and unintentionally dropped its urgency around diversifying that project. And the lesson learned from that case is you've got to actually create those alternative whilst the sun shines. So whilst there's potential, whilst there's money, whilst there's time. Because again, now it's going to be left possibly to a point where it becomes again extremely critical.
Yes.
And then almost at a real dangerous tension level of whether you could actually secure a different future for the town.
Okay.
So I think that's the second one that I would mention.
In other words, the existential threat of the commercial endeavor that stopped being such a big issue, and then suddenly the focus and the urgency
declined.
Was suddenly not.
And that's a
anymore.
mistake.
Yes.
Yeah, again, because you've built this momentum, you've done tremendous investment in time, intellectual capital, money, and to then kind of really see it through.
Yeah.
But then the reason why that didn't happen is my third point, which is the lesson learned, is I think all of us underestimated the deeply entrenched psychology of the mine in terms of holding on. And I guess a lesson from what I would do differently is to have a real appreciation of that up front, and actually a lot more soberly and a lot more transparently try to work with that reality of what letting go really means.
Yes.
And what letting go means without cutting all strings, so that one still has a very active role, but it's not this all-encompassing role that unintentionally then actually stifles the kind of organic arrival of other leaders and or players on that playing field. And I think that that's kind of another thing that I would definitely say that in hindsight I would have a lot more appreciation for, and actually spend a lot of effort there, because we thought we have an intellectual understanding and there's true objective will.
Yes.
Underestimated this subconscious bias.
Yes. So people see the plan, they say, yes, great plan, and then as soon as it comes to actual implementation,
concede the avoidance and the resistance.
Yeah.
And it's almost intangible, and then therefore kind of made it a little bit more of a bumpy ride.
Yeah.
And therefore make sure that all stakeholders, if I kind of then summarize that, really understand what this process means as much as one can, because until you've done it, you don't really know. But to try and let them understand that how complex this is, and how clear one should be about who's doing what, why, up front, and how expensive it might be, or how time-consuming it might be, and what you might have to give up. But it's like any identity death. You first have to give it up before something else can grow. But a lot of us are very hard to cut off the arm, not yet knowing what else might grow from it. So therefore you hold on to want to control that process.
Yes.
And therefore not allowing that process to kind of really mature.
Any final thoughts on things that could have been done differently, or that you learned from this process, or that surprised you?
I think, fortunately or fortunately, coming from investment banking, one kind of definitely learned to kind of see the good side and the upside of humanity, but you also saw some of the darker edges. And I think the other part that was also naturally part of this process, and therefore one has to really just acknowledge as a reality in a town transformation program, is in that comes opportunity, and therefore people that have a a need for power or have an attachment of identity to power, there is the possibility that there's political interference or personal agenda interference. And because that obviously is not made transparent at the outset, it begins to misdirect some of your strategy and there's this unconscious dissent. And they're needing to kind of reveal that enough without shaming the place where it comes from to begin to understand that, but that you can actually redirect that so that we do work towards where some individual interests could be seen to, but ultimately that the collective common goal that everybody has set for itself can actually live, because that's ultimately it, is the higher goal. But unfortunately, some of that gets sidetracked for personal agendas.
Yes.
And that was for me a little bit of a shame, and that one should really heavily guard against, but full well appreciating that it's part of human behavior. The final observation that I have is, as we kind of spoken perhaps in previous conversations, Namibia has got a very strong intellectual capability, and it does have the ability to technically deliver, but it doesn't yet have this actual skill set to focus on implementation and to hold people account to implementation. So there are really great plans, great policies that one couldn't fault objectively, but Namibia at the moment is still in a process where it's finding its legs in implementation confidence.
Yes.
And I think in hindsight, a lot more effort should have been gone into appreciating that there's a lack of that skill set.
Yes.
Although we were leading the implementation for them, we made some assumptions that there's a higher state of readiness of that environment to actually lead and account for implementation.
And execute.
And therefore, more appropriately put, this kind of notion of having execution skills, almost the appetite and the hunger to get things to delivery.
Yes.
Is something that I kind of think is also a future learning that one could take forward.
So not just writing papers and appointing people, but actually getting the entire endeavor over a finish line.
Correct.
This was a fantastically interesting conversation. I've definitely learned very, very much. And thank you to all of the listeners for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, JV.